think, Tony Blair,
Morning.
that the government has gone wrong, particularly over PPE and testing? Because, you know, people don't want to necessarily make this political, and Labour Party has been pretty supportive overall. Is it just that the crisis has overwhelmed the government, or would you say that they simply didn't get prepared early enough?
So, Suzanne, what I'm saying is offered by way of constructive advice, not criticism. I mean, let me just say, I think this is the most difficult challenge I have ever seen for any government. It's immensely complicated. It's got all sorts of different dimensions. And I think it's more to do with being overwhelmed. And really the point that my institute's making in the paper we put out, which is a detailed examination of all the different issues around how you exit from the lockdown. Really, I think you've got to reposition government completely. And I think part of the problem is that many of the skills you need to deal with something like this, which is around things like, you know, production of equipment, how you source different elements of the equipment that you need, how you go to, because at the heart of this has got to be mass testing. Really, what I'm saying is you've got to reorder the whole of government, and you should divide up the different key elements and have senior ministers in charge of each element, divided up in that way with good outside people who've got the skill set that won't be amongst politicians or people in government or the bureaucracy, and get to the point where you've got the capability of dealing with all the different dimensions and not getting overwhelmed. But, you know, I say that with a lot of humility, because I know how difficult it is to be in government and how tough the decision making is. And I'm sure everyone is working flat out, by the way. It's really just a question of whether we're positioned rightly to measure up to the scale of this problem and the need for action and decision making at speed.
There's a piece in the Times today, very interesting, I thought. The military appalled by the planning that's going on here. There is no better group of people in the world than probably our British military. Why are we not using them more on planning and logistics? I mean, the first thing I would have done if I was trying to handle a crisis of this magnitude is turn to the people who actually do run wars.
Yeah, so I think they are involved in certain elements, but I found this, I mean, it's a much more minor crisis, but when I was dealing with the foot and mouth disease outbreak, it was actually only really when we brought in the skill set of the military that we were able to accelerate our ability to deal with it. I mean, I think, you know, in normal government, as you know, Piers, you have your education department, your health department, your industry department, defence department. This is just a government with one challenge. And so I don't think you can leave the system operating as the normal system. And that's really the point that I'm making, because when you come to the exit from the lockdown, this phase of suppression of the disease, which is absolutely right and necessary, I mean, that, in my view, is actually probably a simpler task than how you exit from the lockdown. How you exit is really, really complicated. And unless you have the right skill set there at the centre of government, right from the very beginning, then it's going to be very hard to do things like mass testing, which I think is the, you know, I can't see any other way out of this.
No, I can't.
The worry I have is that...
Let me ask you about
right,
foot and mouth.
Every week that passes...
Sorry, I wanted to ask you about foot and mouth, because you raised it in relation to this. Because I completely agree with you about the mass testing and the complexity of coming out of lockdown. It seems to me extremely difficult. When you fought the foot and mouth crisis, so 2,000 cases of a disease, I remember this, I was editor of the Mirror at the time, and you and I spoke about this at the time quite regularly. You know, over 6 million cows and sheep had to be destroyed to try and halt the disease. There were lots of controls put in then. Public rights of way across land were closed. The Lake District, large swathes of that were closed. The Cheltenham Festival, interestingly, was cancelled, as were other events. The general election delayed by a month. It cost the country $8 billion. Now, it's massively smaller as a crisis than what we're now seeing. But in terms of how you rose to the challenge there, what were the key lessons that you learned about a fast-moving health crisis, albeit with animals in that case?
Yeah, so what I learned, and to be frank about it, we were, for the first weeks of it, behind the curve. And And what I learned is that you just have to set aside all the normal rules and bureaucracy and reposition the government differently. And that's one of the reasons I'm saying what I'm saying now. And it was only actually when we brought in different capabilities, both on the logistical side, within that case, the army, but also a different way of looking at the problem, so that you, as I say, you were taking each individual element and putting people in charge of it who would be doing literally nothing else but concentrating on that task. It was when we did that that we accelerated our ability to deal with it and got on top of it.
Did you attend
right now,
meetings?
If you look at the issue
in that period, did you attend?
Yeah,
did you chair
obviously we were flat out on Cobra, but.
Yeah, but the reason I'm asking is, as you know, Boris Johnson, sorry to speak over you, we've got a slightly different link with you today, so I'll try not to do that. But Boris Johnson, as we know from the Sunday Times reporting at the weekend, that he missed the first 5 Cobra meetings and didn't actually attend one until the start of March, 6 weeks after this was declared a global health emergency. During the foot and mouth crisis, did you chair all the Cobra meetings in that period?
I mean, to be really blunt about it, I can't remember whether I did or I didn't. I mean, look, it's not completely unknown for prime ministers not to attend a Cobra meeting. But, I mean, the point really is, Cobra or not Cobra, of course, the whole of government is got to be concentrated upon this. And I think right now, here's the problem, Piers. What you learn about these situations is that the system does react. And decisions that we're taking 2 months are then brought down to 2 weeks. But the problem with something like this is those decisions have got to be 2 days and sometimes 2 hours. And that's the thing that troubles me. There's just too much, and I say this honestly in a spirit of, as I say, constructive criticism, but all of us know people who are serious people with capabilities to offer, who've been trying to fight their way into the system to offer them. And that's what makes me think just we're not yet organised in the right way for the scale of this thing, so that every single possible avenue is being explored, every single potential lead that gives you a handle on the disease. Because the other thing is, this vaccine could be a long way away. I mean, my institute was very active in the Ebola crisis. It took us 5 years to get a vaccine for Ebola. Now, I know people are accelerating this process now. We've got a lot of promising vaccines here in America, elsewhere in the world. But you can't be sure when those vaccines will be available, and the testing for those has got to be done, with a lot of care.
Meanwhile,
so
you mentioned, sorry, Tony Blair, but you mentioned that the government needs to look at different ways of doing things, and I wonder if we can just be more specific about that. For instance, you'll have seen over the past couple of days, large number of companies saying, look, we've got PPE and we are offering it to the government. They're not either answering our calls or our emails, or they're not placing orders, and we are now sending it abroad. Do you think, is that simply, again, because the government is just getting too many offers and can't process them? Should they have doubled the number of people, for instance, who are, looking at the offers? Or do they need to change their standards, for instance, on PPE, just so that we can get kit to hospitals? And I asked the same question about testing. We keep getting told the antibody test isn't reliable enough. We're given that sort of Brexit echo about a bad test is worse than no test. Do we need to change radically our view on testing so that actually we accept a certain amount of inaccuracy in testing just so that we get the tests out there?
Right, 100% right on both points. So for the first thing on the protective equipment, look, here's where I'm not an expert on this, but there are people who do this stuff for a living, right? There are people who run production lines, supply lines. You need that capacity inside government who and with also the capacity when you get a call from someone, say, look, I can produce you 10 million masks, right? You've got a decision straight away from someone who does this stuff day in, day out. They know whether this is a serious offer or a not serious offer. Get them working on it, because you are going to need vast amounts of this protective equipment and clothing. And on the testing, again, you're completely right. So if you look at the antibody testing, and we actually produced a paper on this yesterday, detailed look, particularly this antibody testing. It's true, there's a big debate around the accuracy of these tests, although what I've learned as I've gone into it more is that the problem with the antibody test is less to do with the quality of the test per se. It's to do with the time in the pathway of an individual's disease that you do the antibody testing. So if you look at some of the data coming out of South Korea, for example, you'll find that in the first week of someone having the disease, you give them an antibody test, and it's often a false test, an inaccurate reading. But after 12 days or 2 weeks, they're almost always accurate. So it's not that the antibody test isn't an accurate test. It's just that it's when you, in the course of the disease, you give that test, you've got to combine the PCR test and the antibody test to have the best capability of ensuring that you get an accurate reading.